All right. Welcome back. And we're going to go ahead and dive right into our next discussion on expanding engagement and climate action. So let me welcome our next guests. We have the Reverend Kyle Mayard-Schaap, who is Vice President of the Evangelical Environmental Network and formerly the national organizer and spokesperson for the Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and Dakila Changyalpa, co-founder and director of the LOCA Initiative, a capacity building and outreach platform at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for faith leaders and culture keepers of Indigenous traditions who work on environmental and climate issues. So they're each going to share also with us about their work, and then we'll go ahead and dive into discussion and Q&A. Keep chatting those questions in the Q&A section of the Action Center, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I'm going to ask Kyle to go ahead and get us started. Go ahead, Kyle.
Sure. Thanks so much, Annie. So much to say and 5 minutes to say it. So I'm looking forward to the conversation with Dakila to come. But just really briefly, the Evangelical Environmental Network is a national organization based in the U.S. working across the country to help educate and mobilize evangelicals toward caring for creation and addressing climate change. We do this not only because we believe it's faithful, because we believe Scripture requires it, and the moral imperative for us to act is evident, but also because it's necessary. White evangelicals represent a disproportionate slice of the U.S. electorate, consistently punching above their weight when it comes to their share of voters in national elections compared to their share of the population broadly. And they also remain some of the most skeptical of the science and least open to proposed solutions when it comes to climate change. But we don't believe that it has to be this way or stay this way. Our work is about helping evangelicals understand, as our good friend Katharine Hayhoe says, that they are already exactly who they need to be to care about climate change and to take action. And we do that by trying to connect pollution, environmental degradation, climate change to values that already motivate evangelicals, values like defending the sanctity of life, especially young kids and other vulnerable populations, honoring the teachings of Scripture, opening up Scripture, moving beyond just Genesis, and sharing how Scripture shouts God's love and care and concern for creation, our call to love it and care for it too, and even where God is bringing it, what God's good future is for the world. And values like loving God and loving our neighbor. Jesus tells us there's no more important thing that we can do other than love God and love our neighbor. But how can we love God when his world that he loves is being destroyed? How can we love our neighbors when we're not defending their rights to a healthy present and a flourishing future? So often, many who are traditionally outside the climate movement, as many evangelicals are, hear climate action and climate change communicated in a way that sounds a little something like this. Here are all of the things about your community and your loved ones that are wrong. Here are all the things that you have to change about the life that you love to be right. When you do that, you'll be ostracized from everyone you know and love, but don't worry, because you'll be more like us. And in the end, the world will be more like we want it to be. Now, that's unintentional, of course. Nobody's trying to communicate that way. But in effect, that's often what people hear. And what we're trying to do in the work that we do is communicate climate action in a way that sounds more like this. Here are all the things about you and your community that are beautiful and that you love. Here are all of the people like you who are doing something about climate change. When you take action, you deepen your connection to these people, and your joy and community and belonging is enhanced, and the world becomes more how you want it to be. And we're seeing some progress with this work. Over 3 million evangelicals have signed on to our pro-life clean energy campaign over the last several years, connecting the clean energy transition to protecting the sanctity of life. Close to 30,000 young evangelicals have been mobilized through EEN's youth engagement ministry, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, but we still have a long way to go. However, we know from other social movements that if we can just mobilize 3 to 5% of our community around climate change, we can change climate politics in the US forever. And to do that, we need everybody, including you. So a couple of quick ways that you can get involved in the work that we're doing, whether you identify as an evangelical or you know people that do, and you can share these with them. One is our EEN Partners Program, an opportunity for grassroots folks to get the training they need in the science, the scripture and theology, the politics, the organizing techniques, and then the support they need as they implement projects in their congregations, in their communities, and with their elected officials. Our Pro-Life Clean Energy, or our Pro-Life Clean Jobs campaign, which is a variation on our Pro-Life Clean Energy campaign, focused specifically on the Recovery Act, making sure that we help people understand that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to advance family-sustaining, clean jobs that will build the clean energy future. And finally, YECA Advocates, our Young Evangelicals for Climate Action Leadership Development Program that's very much like EEN Partners, seeking to equip young Christians around climate science, climate tactics, organizing techniques, putting them in a community and giving them opportunities to put that learning and training into practice. Just a few examples of the work that we're doing. I'm eager to hear from Tequila and to have a conversation from here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, we'll get to that in just a moment. And I know that there's lots of questions that people have along these lines. So Tequila, why don't you share a little bit about your work?
I'm so happy to. And I'm so happy to be here with you, Annie and Kyle, because we all work together in our real life too. So first of all, I want to say greetings from the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people. This area is known as Tijo, which refers to the 4 lakes around Madison, Wisconsin. I come from Sikkim, which most people have never heard of. It's this tiny Himalayan kingdom turned Indian state. And my people are called the Bhutia. We're a tribal community. I grew up in a land where we are protected by Mount Kanchenjunga. And I want to tell this story because it, I think, really connects how I ended up working in environmental science and then moving to the world of faith. Kanchenjunga is the 3rd tallest peak in the world, and almost no one has ever heard of it. And the reason why that is because he's alive to the Bhutia and the Lepcha people of this region. We see him as sacred, alive, and as a deity. And so we will never allow him to be desecrated, and we refuse to take money so that climbing expeditions can desecrate him. When we think about biodiversity conservation or climate change, it's really easy to gloss over the role Indigenous people and tribal people play. The reality is that Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the global population, but they protect and manage over 80% of existing biodiversity today. And there's a reason for that. It's because the worldview that we have is that it is a worldview of interdependence. So for someone like me who was raised in the Buddhist tradition, interdependence is the philosophy that connects everything. It's basically this awareness, this living and breathing awareness that we cannot exist by ourselves. Even the air that's in our lungs that gives me this identity as a self actually comes from outside of my body. And so where do I draw the line of my selfhood when the air actually is giving me life? And so this philosophy provides the root of everything we do, you know, in terms of how we see nature, how we see our relationship and kinship with each other as humans, how we see it with other species. Now, I came to the West when I was a teenager. I always knew I was going to be an environmentalist, and I quickly started studying environmental science and discovered that faith was something no one spoke about, and that it was something to submerge if I wanted to be taken seriously, professionally and as a scientist. And so for a very long time, I often joke that I was this, you know, professional, very rational scientist by day and this practicing Buddhist by night, almost furtively. However, what happened in 2007 is that I was asked by the head of my Tibetan Buddhist lineage in the Himalayas to create environmental guidelines for the monastics in the region. And so I developed what I thought was, you know, 2 weeks of my vacation time. I just developed these guidelines that explain scientifically what the main issues were that were threatening the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, but using Buddhist philosophy with a team of monks, senior monks that he had shared, you know, sort of shared with me as a resource. And I did not expect the reaction. The reaction was that the monks and nuns, as they got more involved in developing the guidelines, they had bigger and bigger questions. And soon what I had in front of me was a group of monks saying they wanted an environmental science training. So on the spot, I had to create a 6-day science training for monks and nuns coming from 22 monasteries, some of whom are very senior, very learned, the PhD equivalents in theology, right? Like MDivs and, MPhils and so on. And what I found was this hunger for science and solutions. And what I discovered was here was the self-activated, self-motivated, self-anointed group of community leaders who had enormous sway in decision-making at all levels, who wanted to be problem solvers and who we in the conservation and climate community had never approached. And so this was not something that clicked for me instantly. It took a year and a half before I realized that what was happening was not the singular movement, a faith-based movement of monks and nuns. At this point, we have 50 monasteries doing projects, everything from reforestation to rooftop water harvesting, to river cleanups, to disaster preparedness, right? At that time, I really thought for a while that it was a singular community. And then because I worked for the World Wildlife Fund, I was able to ask a whole network of our peers if they had worked with faith leaders. And then the results showed up. And it was people had tried it, they wanted to try it, there were all kinds of reasons. So I was able to convince WWF to let me create this program called Sacred Earth. And the program was to work in 5 different biodiversity priority areas across the world to prove that faith-based conservation and climate action moved the needle in places where it had been stuck. So this is really key. If we pick sites where we were having issues that we had not managed to overcome, and so we were working with faiths to actually kind of address that challenge. And it was really successful, which allowed me to go to Yale and then eventually develop this program that's now the LOCA initiative. So there is a reason why the vision of LOCA says inner, community, and planetary resilience are interdependent. You cannot work on one goal without working on the other 2. We cannot achieve planetary resilience without working at the individual and community level. We have 3 priority areas. So we do a lot of closed capacity building with different stakeholder groups. Kyle and I are involved in one of these projects. LOCA supports evangelical leaders all around the world, including here, to work on creation care and climate change. And we're partnered with the World Evangelical Alliance, Arosha, and Care of Creation to do that. We work with the Tibetan Buddhist monastics I mentioned, as well as Indigenous First Nation leaders here in Wisconsin and around the world as well on resilience and protection of sacred sites. We also do a whole movement around public outreach and trying to bridge the gap between religion and science, trying to provide services that build alliances between different religions, and that also bridge differences between activism and academia, because we have such a tendency to silo ourselves in these different identity groups, right? And then the third piece, which is new and emerging, which really brings me back to the importance of having faith leadership be part of these movements, is that we draw upon faith traditions and faith wisdoms to address the issues of eco-anxiety, climate distress, and solastalgia, which is something that we are seeing just emerge among especially young people, among vulnerable populations that are impacted, and among Indigenous people.
Thanks so much. And yeah, there was an entire panel on just that this morning with our health forum. So if folks didn't catch that, I would encourage them to watch the recording later after we post it on our YouTube page. But let's go ahead and dive into discussion. And I just want to remind our audience to chat your questions into the Q&A function of the Action Center on the right of your screen. So again, let's go ahead and dive in here. I'd like to ask both of you, where do you see the greatest potential right now for increasing engagement among people of faith in climate action and advocacy? Kyle, you kind of touched on this a little bit.
Sure, great question. I see some of the most potential right now among young people, at least among evangelicals. As you alluded to, Annie, I was the national organizer and spokesperson for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action for 4.5 years until very recently. And in my work with YECA, I would travel around often across the country to Christian college campuses, hosting trainings, speaking in chapel, leading lectures, and almost to a person, I would hear from young people that they get this. They get it so deeply that the challenge is not convincing them there's a problem. The challenge is convincing them that they have the agency and the power to do something about it. The challenge is not fighting skepticism, it's fighting cynicism and apathy among young people. But the hunger for action is there among young people across the board, including among young evangelicals. And so the task really is empowering these young people to feel as though they have the power to do something about this. And that means giving them opportunities to lead, giving them the microphone in their churches, on their campuses with their elected officials. We need to keep finding ways to put young people out front, because in my estimation, that is where the most power right now resides in the climate movement broadly, as well as among faith communities when it comes to climate change.
Tequila, do you see a particular area?
Yeah, I do. Very similar to what Kyle said, I do see a huge momentum among the religious leadership. I often refer to them as the mid-tier managers. That's who LOCA targets to do capacity building with. But it really is that core group of people who are aware of what the impact will be in their lives. You know, it's very immediate, it's very personal. I also find a great deal of opportunity in how we can bring the sacred back into the science. You know, I have been now in the field of conservation. You know, I joined the World Wildlife Fund in 2000, so it's been a long time. It's been 2 decades. And what I've seen so often is that in the conservation and climate communities approach of trying to convince people that nature matters and, you know, that we cannot afford to cross planetary boundaries, we have relied a great deal on sort of very mercurial, almost like, you know, transactional kind of arguments, you know, very targeted to what we think are the decision makers, which, you know, and they end up being cost benefit analyses, they end up being economic payment for services, you know, red is always there, right? So we really tend to lean on that as a solution. And the reality is that we've moved away from the mobilization of the public as, you know, as one mass. We are very targeted to who we think are the influential stakeholder groups, and that's not necessarily the group that actually moves and creates change on the ground. And so for me, working with faith leaders, what I see again and again is that the dynamic changes because the sacred suddenly enters the room. And then it becomes a conversation around values. It becomes a conversation around what moves us as people. And interestingly, it becomes a conversation around hope and courage. Right? And those are all areas that, for the most part, scientists, I think, struggle to own and lead. So I see a lot of hope in that.
Oh, that's great. And you're kind of getting into a little bit of the next question that I wanted to ask you both, which is, you know, what do you, and it might not be the biggest, but what do you see as a big mistake that people make when trying to expand their climate engagement with people of faith, or as people of faith trying to expand their engagement among their own kind of brethren? Kyle, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think it's a really critical question because it's necessary for us to take stock of our tactics and techniques and to determine if they're working, right? And I think one of the biggest mistakes that I often see when climate communication or climate organizing just doesn't seem to work or just misses the mark is when people who are trying to reach a community ignore what makes that community unique and what values are present in that community, what values are driving the choices and the actions of the people in that community. So much of our work is predicated upon the belief that unless we connect climate action to the things that are already important to people or the things that already motivate people, we're going to have a really, really hard time building a critical mass. And so for people who are trying to motivate and mobilize a community, I think one of the most important things we can do is be really, really good listeners, be really curious in our listening, because people are going to tell us what's important to them if we have the patience to be curious and to listen. And once people tell us what's important to them, then all we have to do is connect climate change to what they say is already important to them. And that's actually not all that hard to do. There are lots of people, communicators out there who help connect climate action to a whole array of diverse values. So I think what we need to do as communicators and as mobilizers is take the time to understand the community we're trying to move and have the humility to listen deeply, to be curious about what motivates people in that community, and then to connect action to those values. I had a professor in seminary who used to say, all change is loss and all loss is pain. When we talk about addressing climate change, we're inherently talking about change that has to take place. We have to make changes. But if we're not communicating that in a way that is sympathetic to the loss and the pain that people will feel when we make that case, we're going to have a really hard time making it. So I often try to remember that and to take that into my interactions with people when I have them.
Tequila, do you have any other thoughts on that?
That was lovely. I completely agree with what Kyle said. And I think what I would add is that it's really important we lead with compassion. You know, in the science world and in environmental and climate world, we really have a tendency to be purists. You know, we are constantly having these dialogues about what kind of strategies are better, adaptation versus mitigation, right? And then we tend to refer to the Anthropocene era to create this sense of urgency, to convince people that it's urgent. And what we don't realize is what we're doing is actually really overwhelming people. You know, I often talk about how imagine that the person you're speaking with is an immigrant single mom, and she's really worried about lead and PFAS in the water. And what you're telling her is that, well, mitigation is more important than adaptation. And therefore, you know, like, it's like, talk about not leading with compassion when we message in that way. I think it's also really, really crucial that we understand that not everyone can do what we want them to do. People have limited capacity in terms of what their priorities are. And that's the reality. That's part of working with vulnerable communities. That's working with, you know, people of color in the United States that are dealing with racism and all kinds of other issues. We have to be able to break down activities so people can own them and lead them. And that requires that we see our solutions as intersectional. Because someone who is working on community organizing and community gardens is actually addressing climate change in their own way. And the fact that we don't count that and we don't measure that as part of the larger climate movement is a real loss to us. So I think it's really important that we just take a much more broader picture and are less black and white in our approach.
We have a few more minutes here, and I wanted to ask a two-part question, one that's coming through our Q&A here. So specifically, as a Christian, as a Buddhist, what appeals to you? What would appeal to you to get you to become more engaged in the climate movement? And then if you can wrap up by just sharing, kind of, where do you get your passion? How do you keep going with all of this that Tequila kind of just referenced? And we've heard a lot about burnout earlier. So two parts.
I'm happy to go first again, although I don't want to keep stealing Tequila's thunder. So if she's okay, I'll take it. I'm not sure if I'm a great case study for that first question when it comes to what motivates me as a Christian to get more involved, because I am a deep theology nerd. I went to seminary. What scripture has to say about God's love and care and concern for creation from Genesis to Revelation and right through the heart of the gospel gets me every time. And every time I revisit it, it's so re-energizing and motivating. And Jesus' own command to love God and love our neighbors is all I need to go deep, because I cannot look at the breadth of Scripture's call to this work and see anything but a clear-cut command for all Christians to be engaged in this work as a fundamental part of their discipleship. And so as someone who has chosen to orient my life around that story, it's inconceivable for me to do anything but all I know how to address this problem. What keeps me going? Similar to that, my deep sense of calling and vocation. I feel deeply that this is exactly in the center of where God has called me to be. And there is, as Frederick Buechner said, deep gladness in that. So even in the midst of all of the pain and sorrow that we see every day in this work, I do have a deep and abiding gladness to be able to do it. My son just turned 3 when I became a dad 3 years ago. The work fundamentally changed for me. I could always conceptualize my responsibility to future generations, but as many poets and authors have aptly put, to now have my heart outside of my body in another body that's going to live for decades to come, that changes the calculus for me and really keeps me going. And finally, to be able to do the work that I do and to watch emerging leaders grow and develop into really powerful leaders themselves and to catch fire and to do incredible things across the country is so motivating. We have countless activists that I've had the pleasure of helping in some small way on their journey toward action, and to watch them as they continue to do that is so inspiring and so motivating for me.
Thank you. And we're all lucky that you're in this work, Kyle. So we just thank you for your leadership for sure. Tequila, how about you?
I think I'll take the second question first. It's sort of, it's all mixed in. I think for me, there are two things that really come to mind. One is just being in nature, just being someone who observes nature, looks at the hydrological cycle, sees the compassion in how, water collects, transpires, it goes up into the air, condenses, comes back as rain, and does it again and again, and that is such an act of compassion. And I think I also see a huge tide of change in this kind of work, in the intersectional work that Kyle and I do working with faith communities. When I first started doing this work, I had to have a whole litany of arguments for why working with faith leaders was relevant. In 2008, I had to have all the stats, third largest category of investors, like all of that had to be there. And 3 years ago, University of Wisconsin-Madison sent an invitation asking me to create a faith-based program for climate and environmental issues. And I never imagined that in 10 years that shift could happen. So I think what I see is not just a receptivity in the faith community, but I see a receptivity in the science academic community as well. And we are at the point where these bridges are being built that were unimaginable 10 years ago, right? So I think that's really powerful. What was the first question? I'm so sorry.
As a Buddhist, what has appealed to you, or what appeals to you, and to be passionate about this work?
I think when Kai was speaking, I was nodding the entire time because, I'm an environmentalist because I'm a Buddhist, and I'm a Buddhist because I'm an environmentalist. There isn't that division. Everywhere I look at the biological basis of life on Earth, and I see a display of interdependence. I see this natural display of compassion and impermanence, right? Buddhism is very much based with this idea that everything is impermanent, and so you embrace uncertainty. And that, to me, is the philosophy through which I understand climate change, and I try and reassure all the Himalayan Tibetan communities I work with, all the Buddhists I know, that, look, we have it. Just like Kyle said, we have it in our traditions. The wisdom is there. The question is, are we looking through that lens to understand what's happening scientifically in the world? And if we can, I think, bridge that division that is created, it's man-made created, right? Like we created that division. If we can bridge that, then I do think that we can reverse so much of what has happened in the last 100 years.
Wow. No, that's talking about what lens are we looking through is so critical. And I think that's helpful. I hope for both our audience who are, part of the faith sector and folks who are coming from the academic or environmentalist communities. So we have to end here. If you asked a question that we didn't get to, we will follow up and share more through our speakers in our blog at another time. So thank you just so much to Kyle and Tequila. And again, I would encourage you to connect with them. We've been sharing out the resources for their work in the Action Center. Think about how you can support and even replicate what they're doing in your own community. So we're going to have another short break and hear from our sponsors before we dive into smaller groups to brainstorm and identify recommendations on the topics that we've been discussing today. So I encourage you to grab a drink, stretch your body, and we'll start again shortly. Thanks so much.